She was only 19, barely an adult, with the world supposed to be wide open before her. But that morning, staring into her boyfriend's eyes, her heart pounded in fear and hope. She hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected it, but she had to tell him. "I'm pregnant," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, but it felt like the loudest thing in the room. The silence that followed was unbearable, pressing in on her as she watched him process her words. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't ask if she was okay. Instead, his face hardened and his jaw clenched. "What are you talking about?" His tone was laced with shock and irritation, as if she just told him some trivial, annoying news. She tried to hold back tears, trying to explain that she was as scared as he was, that they could figure it out together. But he pulled away, a look of disgust in his eyes. "I'm not ready for this. I can't do this," he said, backing away. "You're on your own." Those words shattered her. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to this sudden emptiness where she'd once found warmth and love. He turned and walked out, leaving her alone in that tiny dorm room, her dreams and now her future, feeling like they'd crumbled around her. And then, as if his rejection wasn't enough, she was met with even colder news the next day. The university had a strict policy, and as a pregnant student without a support system, she no longer fit their image or rules. Within days, she was told she'd have to leave her dormitory. The administration, politely yet firmly, explained that she needed to make alternative living arrangements, as if she had somewhere to go. With nowhere to turn, she packed a small bag with the few belongings she could carry, walking out of the life she'd known without any idea of where she was headed. Each step she took felt heavier, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? Where would she go? How would she take care of herself, let alone a baby? Hours later, she found herself in a small park on the edge of town, sitting on a cold bench, clutching her bag to her chest. She watched other people walk by, some in a hurry, others laughing with friends or holding hands with loved ones. She sat alone, feeling invisible, like a ghost in the midst of the living. Her hands trembled, and she couldn't hold back the tears any longer. She tried to silence her sobs, but the pain was too raw, too overwhelming. As she sat there, shoulders shaking, she didn't notice the footsteps approaching until a gentle hand touched her shoulder. Startled, she looked up, her tear-filled eyes meeting the concerned gaze of a friend from one of her classes, a friend she hadn't known well but who had always been kind to her. "Are you okay?" the friend asked, her voice soft and full of genuine concern. She wanted to say yes, to brush off her pain and pretend everything was fine. But the weight of it all broke her, and she found herself spilling everything. The pregnancy, the boyfriend who had abandoned her, the coldness of the university's decision, the utter loneliness that was swallowing her whole. Her friend listened without interruption, a sympathetic look on her face. When the girl had finished speaking, her friend squeezed her hand and said, "You don't have to do this alone. There are people who care, people who can help you. I'll help you." Those words, simple as they were, broke through some of the darkness that had closed in on her. It had been so long since anyone had offered her kindness, even longer since she felt someone truly cared. Her friend encouraged her to seek assistance, to explore options she hadn't considered. She didn't have all the answers, but just the idea that she wasn't completely alone gave her a glimmer of hope. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, she realized she'd been given a second chance. She didn't know where this path would take her, but she knew she couldn't give up. Not when there was a life depending on her now. And though she still felt the weight of the world pressing down on her, something had shifted. The following days were a blur of searching, hoping, and sometimes begging. She followed her friend's advice and looked everywhere for help. Community centers, shelters, anywhere she could find a job or a place to stay. But every answer felt the same. A sympathetic smile, a shake of the head, and a polite, "I'm sorry. We don't have any openings right now." By the end of the week, exhaustion was etched into her every step. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, and each night, she slept in a different spot. Sometimes on the benches outside the library, other times on a stranger's couch when someone took pity on her. But even those acts of kindness were temporary, and she knew she couldn't keep going like this. One rainy afternoon, while walking down a street, she ducked into a small cafe to escape the downpour. She had just enough money for a cup of tea, so she ordered and sank into a chair, feeling the warmth of the drink soothe her for a moment. It was here, as she stared out the window at the rain, that she noticed him. He was sitting a few tables away, a man probably in his late 40s, dressed in a simple but elegant sweater and slacks. What caught her attention, though, was the wheelchair he sat in. He seemed calm, focused, and there was something kind about the way he looked up and smiled politely at the barista when she brought him his order. She was too drained to think much of it, but after a while, she noticed he was watching her, a gentle curiosity in his eyes. When their eyes met, he gave a soft nod. Embarrassed, she looked away, but moments later, she heard the sound of his wheelchair approaching her table. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, his voice gentle but warm. She shook her head, surprised, and he maneuvered himself into place. They spoke briefly, mostly small talk. He asked if she was okay, and she managed to nod, not wanting to reveal her situation to a stranger. But as he continued to talk, there was something in his manner that put her at ease, and before long, she found herself sharing pieces of her story. She told him about the pregnancy, her boyfriend leaving, the university's decision, and the endless search for somewhere to go. The man listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful and sympathetic. When she finished, she half expected him to give the same response she'd been getting all week. But instead, he leaned forward, his voice softer. "I'm sorry you've had to go through all that alone," he said. "No one deserves to be abandoned like that." He paused, his gaze steady. "I know I'm a stranger to you, but I might have a solution." She looked at him, surprised, unsure if he was serious. He explained that he owned a large home just outside of town. It was quiet, with a few rooms that had been empty since his family had moved away. He said he could use some help around the house, and he would offer her a place to stay. She could work for him, but more importantly, she would have somewhere safe and warm, a place where she wouldn't have to worry about where she'd sleep each night. The offer felt surreal. She could hardly believe that someone would be so generous, especially after everything she'd been through. But there was something in his voice, something sincere that made her feel he genuinely wanted to help. After a long silence, she nodded, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Thank you. I don't know how I can repay you." He smiled, shaking his head. "Just take care of yourself and your baby. That's enough." The very next day, she packed up her few belongings, and he drove her to his home. She couldn't believe her eyes when they pulled up. It wasn't just a house. It was practically a mansion, elegant but welcoming, with a large garden and warm lights illuminating the entrance. He led her inside, showing her around, and the more she saw, the more she felt a sense of peace settle over her. He showed her to a guest room, one with a soft bed, a private bathroom, and a view of the garden. She hadn't seen anything so beautiful in a long time. She felt a strange warmth, something close to relief, for the first time since her world had fallen apart. Over the next few days, he was nothing but kind. He made sure she had everything she needed, from fresh meals to comfortable clothes. She helped him with small tasks around the house, but he never demanded much of her. As time went on, she saw a side of him that went beyond kindness. He was deeply thoughtful, gentle, and understanding. He even asked about her plans for the baby, what she wanted for her future. She hadn't thought anyone cared, but he listened like her dreams mattered. Then one evening, he surprised her by taking her to a room down the hall. When he opened the door, she was met with the sight of a newly furnished nursery, a crib, soft blankets, a rocking chair, all arranged carefully, as if waiting for a child's arrival. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, overwhelmed. "You and your baby deserve a place to belong," he said softly. "I want you to know you're welcome here." In that moment, she realized that she hadn't just found a home. She'd found something close to a family. Months passed, and her life finally felt stable, even peaceful. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy, and holding him in her arms for the first time felt like a new beginning. Her days were filled with simple routines and quiet happiness as she learned how to care for her son. The man who had given her shelter continued to be a steady presence, guiding her when she felt uncertain, supporting her as if she were family. He would often come into the nursery, watching her sing her baby to sleep, a soft smile on his face as he listened to her lullabies. She'd never asked him for details about his life. She knew he'd been in a wheelchair for some time, but he never complained, never let his condition define him. He was simply kind, always there when she needed someone, but never intruding, never asking for anything in return. One afternoon, about 6 months after her son was born, she was taking him for a stroll through the garden when she heard the gate click open. She looked up and her heart froze. Standing there, wearing a guilty but determined expression, was her ex-boyfriend, the father of her child. She clutched her son closer to her chest, feeling a storm of emotions, fear, anger, confusion. She had spent so many sleepless nights grieving over this man, and now he was standing here, as if he could just walk back into her life without a second thought. "Hey," he said, his voice tentative. I heard you had the baby. I wanted to see him. I want to make things right." She stared at him, stunned and speechless. Part of her wanted to scream, to tell him exactly how much pain he had caused her, but she could barely form words, the shock too intense. How dare he show up now, after everything she'd been through alone? He stepped closer, his eyes shifting to the baby in her arms. "I messed up," he muttered, barely meeting her gaze. "I know I did, but I want to be there for you both now." Before she could respond, she felt a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. Turning, she saw the man who had taken her in. He was looking at her ex, his face calm but his eyes unyielding. The quiet strength she'd come to know and trust was there, and for the first time, she felt safe, even in the face of her past. "Is there something you need?" her friend asked, his tone steady, almost fatherly. He wasn't angry, but there was a subtle, unmistakable firmness in his voice that made her ex shift uncomfortably. "I'm here to see my child," her ex-boyfriend replied, his voice rising defensively. "I have a right to be in his life." The man next to her took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "You left her when she needed you most," he said, his tone level but carrying an unmistakable weight. "She's built a new life now. I don't think you understand the damage you cause." Her ex-boyfriend sneered, his tone growing bitter. "And who are you anyway?" Some kind of charity case, she found. A silence settled over them, tense and unbreakable, until finally, the man who had offered her a home spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'm someone who cares about her and her child, someone who won't abandon them." She felt a rush of gratitude and a sense of protection she hadn't felt in years. The man who had shown her kindness didn't have to defend her. He had no obligation to her or her son, but here he was, standing by her side like family. Her ex seemed to falter, suddenly unsure. "Look, I want to help. I made a mistake, but I want to be here now." The man beside her glanced at her, waiting to see what she wanted to say. And in that moment, she realized how different these two men were. One had left her at her lowest point. The other had lifted her up when she had nothing. She didn't need to think about it. Her answer was already clear. Looking at her ex, she spoke, her voice stronger than she thought possible. "You're right. You did make a mistake," she said. "But we don't need you. We're okay without you." Her ex-boyfriend stared at her, stunned. He hadn't expected her to have the strength to stand up to him. With a final glance, he muttered something under his breath and walked away, disappearing through the gate. And just like that, the weight of the past felt a little lighter. The man beside her let out a breath, watching until her ex was out of sight. Then he turned to her, a gentle smile on his face. "You're stronger than you realize," he said quietly. And in that moment, she felt a shift, an awareness that had been growing silently. She looked at him, feeling a warmth and gratitude that went beyond words. He had been there for her without asking anything in return, offering her a place, a family, a home. Before she could stop herself, she found herself asking, "Why did you help me? Why did you go out of your way for someone you barely knew?" He hesitated, his gaze soft. "Because I care about you more than I thought I could. And if you let me, I'd like to be part of your life. Both of your lives." Her heart beat faster, her emotions swirling. She looked down at her son, then back at the man beside her. In that moment, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. She felt a wave of calm settle over her as she looked at him. The man who had been by her side through her hardest days, who had shown her kindness and stability. She wanted to build her life with him. Her answer was a simple, heartfelt yes. They married quietly, surrounded by only a handful of close friends in a small ceremony in the garden of his mansion. Her son, now toddling around with chubby cheeks and bright eyes, was there, cooing in her arms as she exchanged vows with the man who would become her foundation, her rock. Their marriage wasn't a grand affair, but it was filled with meaning. Every moment felt real, honest, and full of the promise of a shared future. As they settled into their life together, she saw just how deeply he cared about her and her child. His gentle ways, his patience. Everything about him felt like a gift she'd never expected. He continued to encourage her to pursue her studies, even finding ways to help her balance her time between school, work, and raising her son. And in every way that mattered, he was there for her child, treating him as if he were his own flesh and blood. Over the months, he shared more about his own life, revealing bits and pieces of a past marked by loneliness and loss. He told her about the accident that had confined him to a wheelchair years ago, changing the course of his life. Yet despite everything, he'd maintained an incredible resilience and kindness. She found herself in awe of him, of his strength and the way he seemed to face each day with a sense of quiet purpose. A year passed, and their family grew closer with each day. She saw how much her son adored his stepfather, how he would light up whenever the man entered the room. It was as if he knew, even at such a young age, that this man was someone special, someone who would always be there for him. They shared countless moments together, her husband reading to her son in the evenings, the baby giggling as he listened to silly voices and stories. Watching them together, she felt a peace she had never known before. But something else happened that neither of them had expected. Her husband's health began to improve little by little. Encouraged by her, he started physical therapy again, pushing himself to regain some of the mobility he'd lost. The process was slow, filled with challenges, but he was determined. He wanted to be there fully for both her and their son, and with each passing month, his efforts began to pay off. He regained strength in his legs, first with small steps around the house, then longer distances with a cane. Watching him walk for the first time without his wheelchair, she felt a surge of pride and admiration. His determination inspired her, filled her with hope for their future together. Slowly but surely, he was reclaiming the physical strength he'd once thought lost forever. Not long after, they found out they were expecting a child of their own. The news filled their home with a new sense of joy and excitement. Her husband, who had always dreamed of a family but had never believed it possible, was overjoyed. He spent hours preparing the nursery, making sure everything was perfect for the arrival of their second child. And when their baby was born, a little girl with her father's gentle eyes and her mother's strength, they felt their family was complete. They became a close-knit unit, weathering life's ups and downs together. She went on to finish her degree, achieving the dream she'd once thought lost. Her husband, meanwhile, continued to grow stronger, pushing himself to walk without assistance and even chasing their children around the garden as they grew older. Their home was filled with laughter, with moments of shared happiness, the echoes of a family that had been built from pain, hope, and resilience. Years passed, and her husband became not only her partner but her best friend, her confidant, and her greatest source of support. They had built a life grounded in love, loyalty, and the strength they had found in each other. Looking back, she could hardly believe how much had changed since that dark day in the park, when she had felt so lost and alone. Now, as she watched her children play in the same garden where she had first found peace, she felt a deep, unshakable sense of gratitude. Her life had taken a path she could never have foreseen, leading her to a love that had brought her more than she had ever thought possible. In her husband's unwavering care, in the warmth of their home, and in the laughter of their children, she had found everything she had ever needed. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.